Look at how close you are to finishing. We're all the way to Module 8. And in this particular module, we're going to talk about the remote access role and VPNs, all different things like that. And the remote access role is something you will be installing when you get to the 288 class, 288W, and you'll be turning your one of your virtual machines into a router. So that'll be fun. And we're also going to talk about direct access, web application proxy, all the different things you can do using the remote access role. So the remote access role, of course, is installed by going into Server Manager and going to add roles and features, and it is one of your roles. And one of the role services inside this is going to be VPNs. So VPNs are a way that we can securely establish communication from a client into a network or from one network to another network. So we call the network-to-network a site-to-site VPN tunnel. Some people call it a LAN-to-LAN tunnel, whereas when the client connects, it's typically called a client-to-site VPN connection. Nowadays, we typically use a two-factor VPN connection. So instead of just our username and password, we also may get a code on our smartphone or maybe even some other device that has a timer on it with a code that we can use. But whether or not you use it, you still got to install the VPN portion. So once you install routing and remote access, sometimes we refer to that as RAS, Remote Access Service, then you can configure RAS, and one of the things you can configure it to be is a VPN server. So VPNs use the internet connection or an internal network connection as the transport to connect from one network to another. So there's lots of different tunneling protocols, and Microsoft supports a lot of different ones, and they each have their advantages and disadvantages. So the benefits of a VPN, of course, is users can connect to a local internet provider, and then from that internet provider into your internal network. And you can do this either wirelessly or wired. Many people sit in coffee shops, VPN into their network, and do work from there, and the coffee shops are happy to have the business. So let's take a look at the remote access protocol. It carries network packets over a wide area network link. So anytime you're outside of your local area network, you're considered to be in a wide area network. So sitting in that coffee shop, you're on the LAN inside the coffee shop, but you're connecting to the LAN inside your office using the WAN resources, the wide area network resources, such as an internet service provider. So RAS encapsulates a packet so that it can be transmitted from one end to another. So it just packages it up, and then when it gets to the other end, it gets unpackaged. And then this happens at practically the speed of light, and so you can get a lot of data going. Internet protocols, most commonly used transport protocol for VPN. I don't know of anybody who's using anything other than IP. However, as I mentioned in a previous module, IP is the car, and you could have a lot of different drivers in there, and we're going to talk about what some of those drivers can be. So an early type of connectivity that was not well encrypted was the PPP connection that was used basically for dial-up. And a lot of people used the dial-up for years to dial directly into the server. Many servers had banks and banks of modems to dial into the server. Not a very good, secure, or fast way of doing it. So they came up with something called point-to-point tunneling protocol. Now, point-to-point tunneling protocol is a VPN protocol that can be used with PPP or with just basic IP, so the internet. So since no one really uses phones anymore, or modems, point-to-point tunneling protocol is now used over IP. Encrypts the data using Microsoft point-to-point encryption. And PPTP has gone through a lot of iterations. It started out as 40-bit encryption. It's currently at 128-bit encryption, but most people don't find it's all that secure because it just uses a username and password. There's no certificates or IPsec encryption, so the encryption can and has been broken. The next one that people use a lot, especially Mac and Linux users, is the L2TP, Layer 2 tunneling protocol, which works very similar to point-to-point tunneling protocol. The forwarding is based on MAC addressing, the physical address of the network card, and it does use IPsec, which is a much more secure type of encryption and communications protocol than the Microsoft point-to-point encryption that comes with PPTP. So L2TP can be used either with a shared password as well as your Windows username and password, or it can be used with a certificate. So you can purchase a certificate and have that be the basis of your encryption. SSTP is similar to L2TP in that it uses a certificate. It only uses a certificate. It does not use a shared password. And of course, you use your Windows username and password. And it's definitely more secure than point-to-point tunneling protocol. Many people prefer SSTP because it is a little bit easier to set up. It is very secure, and it uses port 443 communications. One of the problems with L2TP, which uses IPsec, and point-to-point tunneling protocol, which uses GRE, is that a lot of hotels and restaurants will block those protocols. However, they can't block SSTP because it uses the port 443, which is the same port that you would use to shop on Amazon. And no one's going to be blocking any kind of shopping because they would be very upset. So this is a great addition to VPN because it allows you to use a type of protocol that no one is going to block anywhere. Of course, there's always the possibility to get blocked if you go to China, but that's a different story. So it uses SSL, secure socket layer, the same as when you go shopping online. DHCP relay agent is something that is used sometimes when you go from one network to the other. And it could happen when you're on a VPN tunnel. It could also happen if you have many VLANs or many subnets inside your network. So let's say you have your DHCP server on your 192.168.1 network, but you want the DHCP server to service all the different subnets in your entire network, and say there's 20 different subnets. Well, you can add all those different subnets as scopes in DHCP, and then you turn on the DHCP relay agent for all of those different subnets to look back to the one subnet that has the DHCP server in it. So you have to set up the relay agent to do that. You can configure the VPN server as a DHCP relay agent as well using the routing and remote access tool. After a VPN is set up, you can further configure it from RAS. After you've configured VPN server and placed it in production, you do need to monitor who is on it. So there is a tool that shows the list of all the people that are connected to your VPN. So if you see a user that may be no longer with the company, maybe you forgot to disable their account, then that could be a security breach. So definitely want to make sure that only people that you want connected are on there, and so you need to use the RAS tool in order to check that out. Let's talk about remote desktop services. This enables clients to run applications and things like that from a server. It allows sharing of a server. So you could have 20, 30, 50, as many people as you want that you buy licenses for and that you also have resources for on a server. And what they do is they'll all connect using the remote desktop protocol application that comes with all versions of Windows Client in the professional and enterprise area. So they connect to the terminal server and they share the server's applications and resources when they all log in. So the good thing about using remote desktop services is it allows you to have everybody use thin clients, which don't have all the security risks that a regular PC has. And it saves money because you don't have to buy more expensive computers. You can buy these cheap thin clients that cannot get infected since they have a read-only operating system on them. So we use what's called session-based desktops. So the client accesses the remote desktop server on a session remote desktop server. Now the other option to this, which is a little bit newer, is something called virtual desktop. So it's also a form of remote desktop services, but instead of everybody sharing the same server, what we do is everybody gets an individual version of Windows, say Windows 10 for instance, that's running on top of Windows Server 2016 and Hyper-V. So for instance, if I have 100 people using virtual desktops, I would install 100 Windows 10 operating systems onto Hyper-V in my server. And then I would configure virtual desktops so every time user A logged in, they would always get the user A computer virtual machine that goes with it. So that way they always get the same desktop experience. And this is a great way to go because if one of these virtual desktops gets infected, you can create a bubble around it so it can't infect anyone else. Whereas if you use traditional remote desktop services, what we used to call terminal services, if one person infects the computer, now everybody's infected. So this is a really good advantage to the traditional remote desktop services. However, it does cost a lot more because you have to buy a lot more virtual machine licenses that have to be renewed yearly in order to be properly licensed. So you can run applications on the server instead of the client. You might end up saving some money on licensing, maybe not. The thin clients are downsized PCs that have read-only operating systems on them. You get centralized control so you can see what everybody's up to at a glance. And remote desktop not only supports thin clients, but also other operating systems. So you have the remote desktop protocol on Windows 10. You have it on Linux, Unix, Macintosh. They all have a remote desktop protocol application that you can use to remote into the server. Sometimes when you do that from non-Windows computers, you may have issues with sound not working properly going through the connection and also printing issues if you're printing through a network printer. However, local printers seem to not have that issue. So there's 4 different components that make up remote desktop services. One is, of course, the 2016 server itself, running the multi-user remote desktop services thing. We call that application remote desktop services. Whereas by default, it comes with an administration remote desktop services that allows 2 remote administrators to connect to any server. That's free. And it's built into every Windows server. However, if you want non-administrators to log in, then you have to install the remote desktop services for applications. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. So you also have to have the remote desktop services client running on the Windows 10 PC, for instance, or the thin client. Then you have to have the remote desktop protocol. That protocol runs on both the client and the server. So when you launch the client, it uses RDP to get to the server, and the server uses RDP to communicate back to the client. And then you also have the remote desktop services administration tools so you can properly configure the application. So when you install RDS, there are lots of different roles here. The session host is the main one that you need to make this work. However, it does have a webified version, so you can do everything through the web, launch the applications to the web. You have virtualization hosts, licensing gateways, and connection brokers. So out of all of these, the 2 ones you absolutely need are the gateway and the session hosts. The rest of these, the licensing and the session hosts. The rest of these are options to make things more secure, such as the gateway, or make them available on the web, such as the web access. An RDS server employs the remote app. So this is a feature that enables the client to run an application without loading remote desktop. And that's the web version if you're going to do that way. So what you have to do is launch the remote desktop tools in Windows Server 2016 and create these web versions of these applications. And it's very easy to do. Microsoft creates a wizard that allows you to do it very easily. So when the user logs into the website, they see individual applications which they just double click on. So instead of seeing an entire desktop, they'll see just the applications that you want to let them use. Got to have the licensing installed. It is a little bit buggy. Sometimes you end up getting, after 120 days, it stops working properly and you have to apply a registry fix. But for the most part, the licensing works pretty well. If you're doing traditional remote desktop licensing, it's roughly about $100 and it's a one-time fee per operating system. So if we go from 2016 to a newer version in the future, you'll have to repurchase all those again. So who's going to be allowed to access remote desktop services? You don't necessarily want to allow all users. You may not want everybody to have that kind of access. And once they get access, what are you going to allow them to do? So are you going to allow them to launch any application they want? Well, you probably don't want to do that. So you could also accidentally allow them to shut the server down, which would be a bad thing. I've had clients do that before. If operating in an Active Directory environment, consider creating a domain group and then adding those users to that group. That way you don't have to add individual users, which can definitely get out of hand and become cumbersome. So here's installing the remote desktop services when you go into Server Manager and the adding the roles and features option. So there's all the different types of remote desktop options that you can check that we talked about earlier. After you install the RDS role, associate the role services, you can use Server Manager to complete the configuration. And it is a little bit more complicated than it was back in 2008. When they started in 2012, they added more roles in here. For instance, you didn't have 6 different roles back then. You only had 4. So there are some things, such as the gateway, that add additional security. But you do have to configure them in order for them to work. You also want to use a certificate. Now you can use a self-signed certificate, or you can buy a public certificate. The public certificate, what's good about that is you won't get any errors when the person launches it. If you use the self-signed one, they will get an error unless you use group policy to push out that certificate to be a trusted certificate. It's just easier and more secure to get the public one, and it doesn't cost more than about $100 a year. After you configure RDS, you can create a collection of remote apps that we talked about that can be published to the website. You can just give them access to the desktop itself, and then they can launch any application at that time, which is a little bit less secure. So you can also use group policy to standardize the working environment of clients logging into remote desktop. You can have them all have the same backgrounds, the same home page, various different things that give everybody the same look and feel when they log in as each other. So there's some of the different group policies you can put in there. I recommend that you hide things such as the shutdown button, hide the control panel, hide access to the operating system, things like that. Just give them access to what they need. So here's group policy. So we've talked about this in some previous modules. We're going to get a little bit of a deeper dive here. We've got the group policy management editor, which includes the computer configuration and the user configuration. And that's a good distinction to know the difference between the two, which we'll talk about in a second. Security policies are a subset of individual policies. So there's various different types of policies that you can set up in group policy. One of the most important ones are the security policies. So in the security policies, you do things like assign user rights, what they can and cannot log into. Account policies such as password policies, where what's the minimum length of their password and their complexity. So there's lots of different security policies you can set in group policy. So if we take a look at this, we see under the computer configuration, we see some of these security policies. And they're pretty self-explanatory. If they're not, if they're fairly cryptic, you can double click on them and it gives a definition of what they do. So here's some events of audit policies. So we talked about previously how you may want to audit when people log on and off, when they access an object, when they make a change. And here's all the different types of things that you can audit for your clients, so you can confirm that they are not doing things they're not supposed to be doing. Then we have a snap-in to allow account policies, local policies, event login, log tracking policies, all these different types of things that lets you set up security to group policy. You can manually configure one or more policies as well using the group policy management tool or the group policy object editor snap-in if you decide to type in MMC for the Microsoft Management Console. And there's our group policy management editor one more time. And once again, you see computer configuration and user configuration. However, last time we were looking at the computer configuration. Many of the policies are the same in both computer and user, but they're not always going to be the same. Some overlap and some don't. Publishing applications. You can actually use a group policy to publish an application or install an application to a user's computer. However, it doesn't always work. It's kind of buggy. I don't always recommend using group policy to do that. I recommend System Center Configuration Manager rather than publishing the applications through group policies. You can also use some third-party tools as well. Sometimes some of the anti-malware programs also come with application publishing. You can then assign applications, automatically assigned represented on the user's desktop. So basically, if you assign an application, it doesn't really install the application. It puts a little shortcut on there, and if the user says, oh, I need to use that application, they double click on it, and then it installs it from the server. Resultant set of policy basically tells you what group policies are being applied to a user. It can be very useful. So you've got planning, generates a report, and provides the results of the policy changes, and then also logging generates a report on the current policy. So a resultant set of policies is a very useful tool. When you deploy NTFS, you can encrypt things. We talked a little bit about encryption in the last module. I didn't get that much into it, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper now. So we talked about EFS, and that stands for Microsoft's Encrypting File Service. It allows you to encrypt files and folders. Now, you don't have to install this. It's already installed. To encrypt a folder and all of its contents, all you have to do is right-click on that folder, go to Properties, go to Advanced, and you'll see the option to encrypt the folder and all of its contents. And at that point, you can put in a password in order to decrypt those things. You can also set the security on there, so you can set which users can automatically decrypt those folders as well. Fairly easy thing to do. BitLocker is the drive encryption that encrypts all of your hard drives. So you can choose one drive, you can choose all of the drives, whatever it is that you want. Of course, you're going to choose one, you should probably do all of them. Definitely recommend this for laptops, anything that leaves the office. I don't typically recommend BitLocker for a server unless it's in a location that is not locked up. So if you have it out where someone can steal it, then I definitely recommend you encrypt it, because by encrypting it, you make it so they cannot read that data. A trusted platform module is something that's been out for about the last 10 to 15 years, and it's a little tiny chip that gets installed in the motherboard, and it can work with BitLocker. So BitLocker can do software drive encryption without the TPM, but it will work much better if you use the TPM. So you'll have a much higher encryption level by using the Trusted Platform Module chip. And all modern servers and laptops and desktops all come with a TPM now. So there's no reason why you shouldn't use hardware encryption instead of just the software that comes with BitLocker. So sometimes computers, the cheap ones, may not come with the TPM built into them. So BitLocker drive encryption can be used with a USB flash drive that contains a personal identification number. So in lieu of a TPM, you can use a USB drive in order to force encryption or decryption. So when you do encrypt a hard drive with the operating system, it does encrypt everything on there. Now, that's not a problem. It just may run a little bit slower when you go to run things, because it has to decrypt it in order to run it. It can also automatically lock access to a file if it detects unauthorized access. Windows Firewall offers lots of advantages. It protects incoming and outgoing communications, merges firewall filters with IPsec settings, lots of different things. So basically, a firewall is something that blocks traffic or allows traffic based on what you want inside and outside a computer. So you can make it so traffic is both blocked inbound and outbound, or you can allow it outbound but not inbound. It's whatever it is that you decide you want to do. Typically what we do is we block more ports inbound than we do outbound. So we only allow specific ports inbound that we need to run our server. Now, when we install certain features, such as remote desktop, administration mode, or application mode, it automatically adds a firewall rule to allow port 3389 in order to allow inbound traffic for remote desktop. However, it doesn't always work. Sometimes it attempts to do this on its own and it fails, and you have to manually go in and tell it to do it. So it's kind of a pain, but the firewall is customizable, so you can go do that. So you can create exceptions to allow port traffic in for TCP and UDP and IPv4 and IPv6. You can also disable the firewall altogether. Don't recommend that. If you have an anti-malware program that has its own built-in firewall, then that should be fine as well, and it will automatically disable the Windows firewall when that happens. All right, so we talked about lots of good things: security, encryption, And so that covers Module 8, so you know what to do now. By now, you can just go ahead and start working on Lab 8. Don't forget to use those video links that are inside the lab itself. And we'll see you for our final module, Module 9, next time.